Every single year, India's budget is a massive deal. It basically sets the financial roadmap for over a billion people. But this one, the 2026 budget, landed in a really wild time, with the rise of AI and all the chaos in global trade. The government came out with this huge, bold vision for the future. But the real question is, did they actually put their money where their mouth is?
I mean, listen to this. The official vision was nothing short of spectacular. We heard about a brand new semiconductor mission, not one but 7 high-speed rail corridors, shiny new university townships, huge textile parks. They even threw in AI labs for content creators. On paper, it looked like a blueprint for a totally transformed, futuristic India. It all sounds amazing, right?
But as this analysis from the source material asks, once you get past all the exciting headlines, do the actual numbers back up that vision? This explainer is going to dig into what seems to be a recurring pattern, a pretty big disconnect between what's promised and what's actually funded. Okay, so let's start with what matters most to millions and millions of people, the personal bottom line. Section 1, the taxpayer's bottom line, where we're going to look at the direct impact on the middle class. So what was in it for the average person paying taxes? Well, according to the source, the answer is pretty simple. Not a whole lot. Income tax slabs and rates, they were left completely untouched. Yeah, there were a few minor tweaks to make filing easier, but for most people, there was no major financial relief to speak of. In fact, for a certain group, the tax burden actually went up. The source points to something called the Security Transaction Tax. It's a little tax on stock market trades. Well, for folks who deal in more complex things like futures and options, that tax rate jumped up quite a bit. So while most of us saw no change, active traders got hit with a higher bill. Okay, let's zoom out a bit, from the individual taxpayer to the nation's finances as a whole. Section 2, following the money. We are talking about a massive budget of 53.47 trillion rupees. So where does all that cash come from, and where on earth does it go? Now this slide is fascinating. It shows where the government's money is coming from. Take a look. That single biggest slice of the pie, the purple one, at 24%, is borrowing. But now, compare the taxes. The source notes that the blue slice, income tax from people like you and me, is at 21%. That's already bigger than the green slice for corporate tax at 18%. And when you add in GST, which, let's be real, is also paid by ordinary people, the tax contribution from individuals becomes almost double what corporations are paying. And this highlights a major shift over time. The source's analysis shows that, in the past, corporations used to contribute a lot more in taxes, often around the same amount as individuals. But the data shows a really clear trend. Over the years, the tax burden has shifted more and more away from big companies and onto the shoulders of individual taxpayers. So where does all this money end up? Well, after the states get their required share, the single biggest expense for the central government might actually surprise you. It's interest payments. Get this, a staggering 20%, 1/5 of the entire budget, just goes to paying interest on old debt. And that's before a single rupee is spent on new schools, roads, or hospitals. And this brings us right to the heart of this analysis. Section 3, sectors under the microscope. This is where we're going to compare those big, flashy promises we heard about earlier with the actual, cold, hard cash that was set aside for them. Remember those 5 new university townships? Sounds incredible, but the source points out a gap that's been around for a long, long time. Way back in 1964, a commission recommended that India should spend 6% of its GDP on education. The government's own new education policy repeated that same goal in 2020. And yet, the current allocation is still less than 3% of GDP, less than half the recommended target, after 60 years. And you know what? It's a pretty similar story in healthcare. The budget announced new medical hubs and training for caregivers, which is great, but the World Health Organization recommends that nations spend 5% of their GDP on health. India's spending, according to the source, is still stuck at around 2%. You start to see a pattern here, right? Ambitious talk, but the spending just doesn't quite match up. And in some cases, the numbers actually went backwards. Despite all the talk about high-speed rail and economically powerful cities, the source found that the budget for urban development, the money for things like clean water, sewage systems, and public transport, was actually cut by 11.6% compared to the year before. But okay, maybe the most startling example of this gap between what's allocated and what actually happens comes from pollution control. The source highlights the 2024-25 budget, where the government set aside 8.58 billion rupees to fight pollution. Now that sounds like a decent chunk of change.
So, here's the crucial question. Of all that money they allocated, how much do you think was actually put to use? How much was really spent on the ground? The answer, according to the source's data, is just 160 million rupees. That's less than 2%, not 20, 2. Less than 2% of the money set aside to tackle one of the country's most critical health crises was actually spent. This shows a massive gap, not just in how much is promised, but in how much is actually done.
So let's zoom out again. How does the budget really tackle the big picture issues? Section 4, Jobs and Global Headwinds. The subtitle really asks the key question here. Does the budget address India's biggest challenges?
On unemployment, which is one of India's absolute biggest crises, the budget laid out a long list of initiatives, focusing on strategic manufacturing, creating those mega textile parks, a fund for small and medium businesses, even upskilling tourist guides. On paper, it looks pretty comprehensive.
But here's the critique from the source material. These are all indirect, long-term measures. They don't have any concrete, measurable targets for creating jobs that could actually address the massive scale of the unemployment crisis that's happening right now. It's a plan for the future, sure, but what about the millions of people looking for work today? Now, to address that global shift towards AI, the budget did make one really major move. It's offering a 20-year tax holiday for foreign companies to come and build large-scale data centers in India. These things are basically the engines that power AI, so this is a huge incentive to attract investment. But the source raises a really critical question here. These data centers use an absolutely enormous amount of energy and water. In a country that's already facing shortages of both, what is the potential environmental cost of giving foreign companies a 20-year tax break to build these massive facilities on Indian soil? So what does this all add up to? Well, that brings us to our final section, which asks the big question, are we seeing a pattern of promises? Here's the source's final take on it all. To sum everything up, a direct quote from the source material just puts it bluntly. We've heard pleasant speeches, several schemes were announced, but the numbers show that it won't have a significant impact, and that really captures the core argument of this whole analysis. And that leaves us with the final question. Is this a budget that truly lays the financial foundation for a transformed India, one that's ready to take on the challenges of tomorrow? Or, as the source suggests, is it just a repeat of a familiar pattern? Big, grand visions, followed by numbers that seem to tell a very different story.